Scientists declared this tree extinct. 90 million years ago then, a park ranger in Australia found 60 of them alive at the bottom of a canyon nobody had ever walked. If you've spent any part of your life watching the natural world quietly disappear, this is a story that runs the other direction. Because when Australia's worst fire season came directly for those trees, the ones that had already outlasted the dinosaurs, humans didn't stand back and let them go. If you haven't heard this before, most people haven't. That's exactly why this channel exists. WildRevival covers the ecological wins that mainstream nature documentaries don't bother with if that's the content you want. Subscribe, we find the stories that got buried. This video is about a tree specifically. The last known wild specimens of a species that went extinct, or so every paleobotanist on the planet believed, around 90 million years ago. You clicked because the title promised something rare. It's rarer than you think. When most people hear a story like this, they assume it's a footnote, a curiosity, something that happened in a lab. Got a press release and then quietly faded. That's how most conservation stories go, right? Scientists find something unusual, put it in a greenhouse somewhere, and call it saved. That's what most people think happened here. What actually happened with the woolly mammoth is one of the strangest conservation responses in recorded history. The people who found it didn't just protect it. They ran a global operation that changed how we think about saving a species. And then just when it looked like it was truly safe, Australia's worst fire season in living memory nearly destroyed everything in a single week. Hey race, the shape of this video, the discovery, the scientific bombshell that dropped on the botanical world, the secrecy operation that followed, the worldwide distribution strategy that was either genius or desperate, depending on who you asked, and the bushfire rescue mission that, if you don't know the details, sounds almost too dramatic to be real. WildRevival has spent years digging into ecological restoration, stories that don't make the front page. This one deserves to if you already have a feeling. This is going to be one of those stories you want to tell someone about. Go ahead and hit like. It helps us find more people who'd want to hear this. Wollemi National Park sits a few hours northwest of Sydney, and on a map, it looks like a large green patch on the ground. It's one of the most tangled, vertical, inaccessible wilderness areas left in New South Wales. 500,000 hectares of sandstone so gorges, steep and remote that entire sections had genuinely never been walked by a human being. David Noble worked there as a parks and wildlife field officer. On weekends, his hobby was descending into unmapped slot canyons just to see what was there, not for any formal purpose. Because the maps had blank spots, and blank spots bothered people like Noble. On a Saturday in September 1994, he abseiled into one of those gorges with two friends. At the bottom, in a narrow canyon, where the sun barely reached the floor, they found something that stopped Noble cold. Picture it. You've spent years working in Australian bush. You know eucalyptus, you know the ferns. You know what the light looks like through the usual canopy. And then at the bottom of this canyon, there's a stand of trees that look like they came from somewhere else. They're tall up to 40 meters high. The bark is dark and knobbly, almost like it's bubbling. One of Noble's friends later said, it looked like Cocoa Pops had been melted onto the trunk. The leaves are soft and fern-like, not the waxy gray-green leaves you see everywhere else in the park. The whole grove had a quality that Noble later struggled to describe. Ancient, not old ancient. Noble wasn't a botanist, but he knew enough to know. He had no idea what he was looking at. So he broke off a small branch, put it in his pack and carried it out of the canyon, fully expecting someone at the office to give him an easy answer. Nobody did that moment. Noble, standing at the bottom of an unnamed canyon, holding a branch he couldn't identify, is where this entire story begins. Not in a lab on a Saturday afternoon. In a gap on the map because one person had the habit of going places nobody else bothered to go. That habit, it turned out, changed botanical history. I want to ask you something before we keep going. Was there ever a place in the natural world, a forest, a river, a stretch of coast, that you remember from when you were younger, that feels like it's gone now? Drop it in the comments. I think about this a lot, and I'd genuinely like to know. When Noble's sample reached the botanists in Sydney, nobody could place it. The foliage looked almost fern-like. The bark didn't match anything. In the conifer records on file, So a proper team went back in, carefully by helicopter to collect real specimens. And that's when the story stopped being a curiosity and became something much larger. The identification process took months. The specimens were worked on by Wyn Jones from National Park and Jan Allen from the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney. What they confirmed piece by piece was not just a new species, not just a new genus. They were looking at a lineage that had not been seen alive on this planet for approximately 90 million years. To understand what that means, paleobotanists had only ever known this plant existed because of fossil impressions, leaf shapes pressed into rock during the Cretaceous period. Nobody had ever seen a living cell of it. Nobody had ever watched one grow. The only evidence it had existed was in stone. And here it was alive. In a canyon a few hours from Sydney, scientists reached for the only comparison that seemed to fit, finding a small living dinosaur. Not metaphorically. That's genuinely how the botanical world framed it. The species was formally described in 1995, published in the Australian botanical journal Tanoco, and named Williamia nobilis. The name does two things at once. It honors David Noble, the man who found it, and nobilis is Latin for noble, which for a species that survived 90 million years feels earned. There's something almost unsettling about a canyon that hid the world's oldest living tree species behind a name that means exactly that. The identification crisis matters to the rest of the story. The moment scientists confirmed what they had, a living relic from the Cretaceous, everything changed. This wasn't a discovery to be published and celebrated. This was a discovery to be protected. Because at that point, scientists knew something that made the whole situation terrifying. There were fewer than 100 individual trees in the wild, all of them in one canyon. One bad event from total extinction. The people who realized that had to make a very fast decision about what to do next. If the 90 million year number landed the way it should, go ahead and hit like that number. Took me a while to absorb too. Stories like this one, where the science and the human drama are completely inseparable, are what WildRevival is built around. Subscribe if you want to know. When the next one drops, we don't put out a lot of videos, but when we do, they're worth your time. Most conservation stories follow a predictable pattern. Discover something rare, announce it to the world. Hope attention translates into protection. The people managing the Wollemi pine decided to do the opposite. They kept it secret for months. After the formal identification, the Australian government, specifically the NSW, National Parks and Wildlife Service, made a deliberate decision to classify the location of the grove, not just protect it, hide it. The GPS coordinates were not shared. The canyon was not named publicly. Team members who knew the location had to sign confidentiality agreements. Even the discoverers themselves weren't told the full picture for about 6 months. When journalists started asking questions, and they did because word leaked that something significant had been found, they were given just enough to write a story, but not enough to find it on a map. The biosecurity measures that followed were closer to what you'd see around a disease outbreak than a nature reserve. Equipment decontaminated before and after entry. Strict limits on who could visit. Helicopter landings only in approved zones to avoid contaminating the soil. There's a moment early in the protection operation that tells you exactly how fragile the situation was. A helicopter sent to collect pine cones. The first step in any seed banking effort accidentally clipped one of the pines with its rotor blade on the approach. One rotor blade, one of fewer than 100 surviving trees. The margin was that thin. The secrecy wasn't just caution. It was a calculated response to a specific risk. A site announced to the world would attract hikers, collectors, journalists, and almost certainly people would want a cutting of the world's rarest tree. As a trophy, any one of those visits could introduce a pathogen, a soil fungus, an invasive root competitor. One bad visitor could end the species. So they hid it. That decision, unusual, uncomfortable, and widely criticized at the time, turned out to be exactly right. But hiding it was only ever a short-term answer. Even perfectly hidden, those trees were sitting in a single canyon. One fire, one disease, one flood, and they'd be gone. The next decision they made was even bolder. What I keep coming back to, The people running this program made decisions that went against every instinct to publicize a good news story. They kept quiet when the easy move was to celebrate. Do you think that kind of restraint is rarer now than it used to be? I'm genuinely asking. Drop your thoughts below. The secrecy bought time. But the people who understood the math knew that keeping a secret wasn't the same as keeping a species alive. What they did next turned conventional conservation thinking upside down. Maybe it was the smartest move in decades. Maybe it was an admission that they were already running out of options. Probably both at some point in 1998. A group of Australian scientists sat down and acknowledged something that takes real intellectual honesty to say out loud. A secret location is not a survival strategy. Secrecy protects a population from people. It does nothing against fire, drought, or disease, or the particular cruelty of having everything in one canyon, so they made a decision to scatter the species across the world. Scientists began cloning the Wollemi pine at scale. Not dozens of trees, but eventually hundreds of thousands. Seeds were collected under strict protocols. Cuttings were propagated. Young trees went to botanical gardens on every inhabited continent. Kew Gardens in London, botanical gardens across the United States, institutions in Europe, Asia, South Africa. Then, they did something that had never really been tried at this scale with a critically endangered plant. They put it into commercial sale. Starting in 2005, Wollemi pine seedlings were sold to the public. In Australia, the UK, the US, and elsewhere, the logic was simple. If thousands of private gardeners are growing this species in backyards and conservatories all over the world, the species cannot be wiped out by any single event. The wild grove stayed hidden and protected. The species itself was suddenly everywhere. This is the part that tends to surprise people, because it runs against the instinct that rare things should be guarded, not spread around. But the Wollemi pine program was built on a different principle. The most dangerous place to keep something irreplaceable is in one location. By distributing the species globally, the conservationists created a living seed bank that couldn't be killed by one fire, one pathogen, one catastrophic failure of institutional conservation. They made the species resilient, not by protecting it more tightly, but by letting it go. It was working. And then in the southern summer of 2019, Australia caught fire on a scale that hadn't been seen in living memory. Everything built over 25 years was suddenly in the path of it. If that distribution logic landed differently than you expected, the idea of saving something by scattering rather than locking it away, tells me this kind of storytelling is what you want more of. By 2019, hundreds of thousands of Wollemi pines were growing in gardens and greenhouses around the world. The species was, by almost any measure, safer than it had ever been since the Cretaceous. But those 60-odd trees in the Wild Canyon, the original ones, the only ones that had survived every extinction event for 90 million years, were directly in the path of the worst fires Australia had seen in a generation. The Black Summer bushfires of 2019 and 2020 burned more than 18 million hectares across Australia. Nearly 3 billion animals were killed or displaced. The smoke reached New Zealand, South America, and the stratosphere. One of the worst ecological disasters in Australian recorded history, and in the middle of it, a small team of people rappelled into a hidden canyon to hand water a grove of trees that had survived since the age of dinosaurs. When fire mapping showed that the Willamette was directly in the path of the advancing Gospers Mountain fire, one of the largest individual fires burning that season, the decision was made quickly. The wild population had to be actively protected. What followed combined the logistics of a military mission with the delicacy of a botanical rescue. You cannot drop fire retardant on a grove of trees you're trying to save. Many of those chemicals are toxic to the very plants they land on. So instead, a team of firefighters, trained specifically for this and cleared for the classified location, was helicoptered in. They installed an irrigation system in the canyon, hoses and sprinkler heads fed by a water supply that also had to be flown in. They established a fire break in the surrounding bush. Then they waited. The fire burned around 3 sides of the canyon. At one point, it crested a ridge less than a kilometer from the grove. The irrigation system was running. Suppression foam was deployed in the surrounding bush. Every single tree survived. I want to sit with this for a second, because it's easy to move past it. Those trees have been in that canyon for, at minimum, thousands of years, possibly much longer. They survived whatever ended the Cretaceous. They survived whatever reshaped the Australian continent. They survived in silence, hidden for 90 million years. And the thing that finally almost got them was a season that lasted a few months. The reason they made it through wasn't geological luck. It was a decision made by specific human beings on specific days to go in there and fight for them. I find that harder to hold in my head than the 90 million years, honestly. I want to know something. When you heard that firefighters were sent in specifically to protect those trees, not property, not people, just those trees, what did that feel like? I think the answer says something about where you stand. On all of this, tell me in the comments. If that bushfire sequence gave you that feeling of something being genuinely saved. The like button is right there. It takes half a second and it tells the algorithm to show this to more people. Who'd care about it? These are the stories WildRevival was built to tell. The moments where something turned around. Subscribe if you want to be there when we find the next one. We'll never spam you, but when we put something out, it's worth the notification. The wild grove in the Wollemi Canyon is still there. Still classified, the coordinates are still not public. That's intentional and it's still the right call. As of the most recent public updates from the Royal Botanic Gardens and Parks Authority, the wild population is holding at roughly 60 to 100 matured trees, depending on how you define mature, with some natural regeneration occurring. Scientists continue to monitor the grove, with extremely restricted access outside that canyon. The picture looks genuinely remarkable. The global distribution program has resulted in more than 300,000 Wollemi pines growing in private gardens, botanical institutions, and conservation programs across more than 60 countries. You can order one online in most of the English-speaking world. Stop and hold that for a second. A species that had 0 living representatives outside one hidden canyon in 1994 now grows in gardens across 6 continents. That is one of the most quietly extraordinary conservation outcomes of the last 100 years. The Wollemi pine story doesn't end. The wild population is still vulnerable to disease, to climate shifts, to things nobody can predict. The biosecurity protocols are still in place. The location is still secret. But the species itself, the genetic lineage that began when dinosaurs were still walking, is safer right now than it has been at any point in human history. That's the sentence I keep coming back to. Because of one man who went to see what was at the bottom of a canyon on his day off. Before we wrap up, one last question. Is there a species, an animal, a tree, a place that you genuinely thought was gone forever, that later turned out to be holding on? Or one you're still waiting to hear good news about? I read every comment on this channel. Tell me, in 2019, while Australia burned, a team of firefighters was sent into a hidden canyon to protect a grove of trees that nobody outside, a small circle of scientists, even knew existed. Those trees were alive when T-Rex was alive. They survived every mass extinction, every ice age, every geological upheaval of the last 90 million years. In silence in a canyon, waiting to be found. David Noble found them on a Saturday. Not because he was sent there, because the map had a blank spot, and he went to look what followed. The secrecy, the cloning, the global distribution. The bushfire rescue was not accidental. It was a deliberate, sometimes controversial, and genuinely extraordinary human response to a question that doesn't get asked often enough. What do you do when you find something irreplaceable on the edge of disappearing? The answer, it turned out, was to hide it, clone it, send it everywhere, and when the fire came, go in and stand between it and the trees. The woolly mammoth is now growing in more than 60 countries. The wild grove is still secret, still alive, and the species that dinosaurs walked past, that geological time tried repeatedly to erase, is more secure today than at any moment in recorded human history. If that doesn't make you feel something, I don't know what will. If this story gave you that feeling, you know, the one where something that seemed impossible turns out to have made it, please hit like. It genuinely helps us find more people who need to hear. This WildRevival exists to find stories like this one. The ecological comebacks, the forgotten victories, the species nobody thought were coming back. We're not covering the disasters. We're covering the moments after the disaster, when something holds on, if that's the channel you want. in your subscription list. We'd be glad to have you hit subscribe. Well, see you on the next one.